Okay, the fourth, and I think it'll be the last lecture. So, four lectures times 15, 20 minutes, an hour and a half of video lectures for you guys. That kind of makes up for the technological horror that tonight's been, I hope. Anyhow, so we were talking about the ancient Rome, and particularly the Roman Empire. But before I get to the empire itself, to talk about that, particularly as the context for where Christianity evolves, I want to bring up an important feature of Rome, and it's actually it comes from something one of you very cleverly asked me about in one of your journal responses, and I thought it was a really great question, and that had to do with the relation between ancient Greece and Rome, since they're both kind of happening around the same time. What the relation between the two is, very good question, and actually it's a really important one. So, as you guys know, when we looked at ancient Greece, we looked at the height of ancient Greece, the city-state of Athens in the 5th century BC, which would be between 400 and 300 BC occurring, which is around the time that Rome is beginning to grow after it conquers Carthage and and it's beginning to gain a lot of northern Africa, expanding its claims. What happens is around 150 or so BC, Rome essentially conquers ancient Greece. They conquer Sparta, and they conquer Athens and the Alexandria, which is the great city Alexander the Great is trying to make. Essentially, they conquer all of Greece, and they do raise a lot of it to the ground. I mean, one of the there's some bad things that come out of conquering, and probably the biggest tragic thing that happens is when Rome invades Greece. Stupid. It was not what the powers that be wanted to have happen, but they burned the great Alexandrian library to the ground, which means we've lost God knows what, because that library is still to this day considered the greatest library ever on the face of the earth, where they stored so much, text, so much rich material. But for the most part, when Rome conquered ancient Greece, like they did other places, they kind of pillaged it. They didn't like destroy everything. The idea was that and this happens a lot, and we're going to talk a lot about this particularly next week, that when an invading force conquers and there's kind of like a civilization gets absorbed into a conquering civilization, what happens almost all the time is a civilization that conquers will take what's great of that civilization they conquered and absorb it into their own, which is what happens when they conquer Greece. Rome, for all intents and purposes, were not the kind of ingenious geniuses, the innovative thinkers that the Greeks were. They were brilliant with a lot of other things, but critical thinking was not their forte. So instead, what they discovered was the architecture and the splendors of ancient Greece, and they essentially stole it. I mean, they literally, guys, there was literally for decades a caravan that went the hundreds of miles between the city of Rome and ancient Greece that was just a caravan of elephants and slaves and all kinds that were taking literally buildings from ancient Greece to Rome, statues, paintings, texts, so that basically Rome itself became like ancient Greece. They also got a lot of their ideas from the Greek philosophers and brought that to Rome. And what you basically get then from 150 BC up until, well beyond it, is what we call the Greco-Roman influence. Yes, there is a separate Rome, but really the sort of philosophy that Rome develops, including eventually Christian philosophy and theology, is really and the architecture and art and all that is what you would call Greco-Roman, which means it's a combination of Rome and Greek thinking. And you can see that in the architecture. Rome adopted, the architecture of Greece, things like the columns and the magisterial buildings Greece would use, but they innovated that into their own architecture with things like Roman arches, which become really important for what we use today, like in making bridges or things. The Romans adopted Greek architecture and created indoor windows and things like that. Romans, like I said, created highways using basic ideas from Greece. They created the dome or a ceiling, which is why like capitals and states, and our United States capital, Washington, D.C., is a dome. That's a Roman piece of architecture stuck on top of columns, which is Greek, hence it's Greco-Roman. So a couple things I want to bring up which become the miraculous sort of infrastructural feats that Rome created in this, absorbing of Greek knowledge and geometry and architecture. One is the highways. Rome developed hundreds of miles of a highway system that all would go out from the city of Rome to the outskirts of the empire to keep everything connected. And I'm talking about major highways at the time that are still there, many of them. If you visit Europe, you can still see the highways that they created out of amazing kind of stone and foundation so that horses and chariots could like have a clean right through the empire. And this highway system, like spokes on a wheel, would go out from Rome to the outskirts of the empire so that Rome could be connected to all of its other cities and suburbs and all the way to the furthest reaches of the empire. This served a huge basis for connectivity for Rome as a place to connect everybody, including communication. Rome developed, because of this, a postal system, an amazing one. They had mail delivered throughout the empire, but it also allowed for Rome to flourish and grow because a highway system keeps the military mobile. It was easy for a military to mount an expedition, charge up one of the highways to the outskirts, and defend Rome from the barbarians. Big issue we're going to talk about maybe in this lecture, but probably next week. That barbarians, these Nordic tribes that are growing and keep threatening to break through into Rome, but Rome during the empire is way too powerful for them and are able with their massed military and this highway system to keep them at bay. But the other thing that is a marvel of invention that Rome creates out of gaining architectural influence from Greece into their own Roman ingenuity is something that we still use today. One of them is bridges. Romans created the first kind of bridges on their highways. We still use the basic design of the bridges that Rome used with the Roman arches to support the roads. But the other thing that we still use, which is the thing that really makes Rome a powerful civilization, aqueducts. These aqueducts that Rome created were designed, hundreds of miles of them made out of stone, were designed to bring fresh water from the fresh water reservoirs in the Alps down into the cities like Rome, particularly Rome. And I want you to think of it this way. I said to you guys way back in the first class that you had to have two ingredients for a civilization to survive and thrive. Grain, you have to have grain. That was the one thing that you had to have, that was the source of pretty much all nutrition and food, grain, and fresh water. Without one or the other, without one you can't have the other, quite frankly, but without one or the other, you do not have a civilization. And I remember I told you guys when we were talking about Greece, fresh water was so important because in most areas of the civilized world, they didn't have water treatment plants like we do today. You couldn't really drink the water. You had to drink like something like beer or wine, something that would ferment the water so that it would get rid of the bacteria and stuff like that. Or dig wells, which was quite hard to do. Or what the Romans discovered was, well, way up there in the north, there's these mountains with tons of fresh water. We need to get that fresh water running down to Rome and down to the cities of Rome. They developed these aqueducts that would keep fresh water literally running along a bridge for hundreds of miles, slopes that would move straight down into Rome into their waterworks systems, the pipes they built under the ground to bring fresh water to everybody. And hence, a civilization thrives. Again, without fresh water, you can't have much of a civilization, guys. And by the way, ancient Rome still has to this day the um, the record of the longest underground man-made tunnel. And that is the sewer system that runs in the Middle East, that runs from the Middle East through Greece almost to Italy. It's still there, and many of it is still functioning under the ground. It's amazing. One of the things they learned through that we still use today in places like New York City, one of the things they learned is when you have fresh water constantly running, once you've built the underground pipes to support it, the fresh water will keep the pipes, thriving. If the fresh water, for instance, if the fresh water stopped running and underground man-made pipes, they'd collapse. I don't know if you guys know that all of the freshwater water pipes underneath Manhattan that give all the fresh water from the Catskills, about 200 miles away, all the fresh water people drink in New York City comes from the Catskills. That water keeps running day in, day out in the pipes under the ground, and it keeps those pipes held together. If the water for some reason stopped running, which God forbid it would, it probably won't unless there was some kind of drought of a millennium, literally the pipes would collapse. Literally, they just fall apart, which is why you have a whole waterworks system that works night and day underneath Manhattan. It's probably a horrible job, reinforcing these pipes and trying to dig new ones and stuff like that. So, two huge inventions that Rome created. Anyhow, with that said, what I want to talk about is what led to the empire in Rome, how it moved from a republic where there would be essentially a leader chosen every few years, or somebody would alternate to essentially an autocrat. Still a republic, essentially, but somebody who would rule for life kind of idea. Leading up to the date 44 BC, which is a date you should know, along with 1066 and 1776 and 1492 and all those dates. Leading up to 44 BC, there grew what was called the cult of the generals, the cult of the military. As the military grew huge, it also grew kind of dangerous because there was known amongst leaders and senators in the Republic that generals were becoming these heroic figures, powerful in their own right, and that one of these figures could easily capture the public and sort of do what they want, kind of like take over Rome and change everything kind of idea. And it's true. The idea is that these generals who would go off and conquer more lands would come back home through the triumphal arches of Rome, and they were celebrated as gods. And they were also, the generals become wealthy, and they're the ones who then would fund the great gladiator games and the Colosseum to make people love them even more. There was huge adoration of the generals. One of the generals, Julius Caesar, became godlike. And folks, Julius Caesar, he wasn't, he was, his name wasn't Julius Caesar before he became the Caesar, but we'll just call him Julius Caesar. He was, throughout history, the most powerful general who ever existed on the planet. And one of the big things he did was he invaded what's called Gaul at the time and took parts of Gaul for Rome. Gaul today is what we would call France, that whole area that we call France. And he got half of it. And he argued through messengers with the emperor, who wasn't an emperor at the time, but the Caesar, who was in charge at the time. Let me keep these troops, and I can go and cross the Rhine. At the time it was called the Rubicon or the Rhine, and I could invade and take the rest of Gaul. It's easy, I can do it. But the Caesar wanted Julius back. No, got to return. You've done too much. We can't take off war. We can't risk it. Julius Caesar, however, kind of mutinied. And that whole phrase to cross the Rubicon comes from Julius Caesar crossing the Rhine and saying, "To hell with this, Caesar. I'm going to go do this anyhow. We can do it." 6 years later, he does. He conquers pretty much the rest of the known world and returns, yes, a mutineer, but a mutineer nobody could do anything with because he came back a god to the people. He was celebrated as like more powerful than you can imagine. And then when he goes off and conquers Egypt and has the famous love affair with Cleopatra and takes the Middle Eastern world for Rome, he's invincible. Essentially, what happens is Julius Caesar becomes the leader and anoints himself emperor, which means the ruler for life, which is essentially the end of the republic, because to say that means I'm the autocrat. You know, my leadership has no end until I die or you take me out kind of idea. Now, he was friends with all the senators and he kept them. He didn't want to destroy that, but he was kind of an arrogant guy. He felt that my rule should go, I'm in charge kind of thing. 44 BC is such an important year in history because that is when the empire really begins. And it begins because of an incident. You might hear the phrase, beware the Ides of March. This has to do with 44 BC. All of the senators saw that the Republic, because of Julius Caesar, was under huge threat. And they conspired together, the most famous being Cassius and Brutus, who conspired together. They were good friends with Julius Caesar and decided that for the benefit of the Roman Republic, we need to take out Julius Caesar. We need to get rid of him. And so they contrived to invite Julius Caesar into the Senate palace for kind of like a celebration. But instead, they're there to ambush him. And when he walks into the dark place, kind of going, "Hey, where are you guys?" All of them come out and take turns stabbing Julius Caesar so that each one is guilty of killing, not just one person. And famously, Brutus is the last to stab him. And Shakespeare has it in the famous play, has it that Julius Caesar cries out, "What, you too, Brutus, my friend?" Before Brutus stabs him. They killed Julius Caesar. Now, Brutus and Cassius and the rest, they all thought that they'd saved the Republic. But all they did was make matters a lot worse for themselves because they became enemies of the state by doing this. And it brought Augustus Caesar, excuse me, I think the uncle of Julius, who was a very powerful general, to sweep into Rome. And a long story short, he has the assassinators on the run, and Cassius and Brutus both commit suicide. And essentially, Augustus Caesar establishes the empire. He establishes himself as the emperor. Because of this threat to the republic, I'm establishing myself as autocrat. He kept the Senate, but he essentially said, I'm creating an empire and my rule goes. Now, as far as empires go, like Augustus Caesar, he had his autocratic moments, but generally, people loved it. He was a figurehead who was kind of likable, and he just maintained the empire the way it was, and he let the generals go about and do their business, and the senators, which is the way kind of the empire went for the next 300 years. So there's always these debates about what was better, the republic or the empire, and really when you boil it down, the empire was a kind of nicer life for people than the republic, kind of an irony of history in some ways. But be that as it may, Rome becomes an empire. Now, before I jump, well, I see I'm almost at the 20-minute mark, guys. So, you know what I'm going to do? I have one more thing to say about the whole issue of Julius Caesar and the empire. And I'm going to reserve the rise of Christianity for a separate lecture that I won't give you guys right now. I'll wait and as an introductory lecture for our class next week. But the thing I wanted to say about Julius Caesar was that he was actually a really bright guy, contributed two gigantic things to the Western world. He was very bright in realizing that the Roman Empire had grown huge and kind of unmanageable. And think about it, all the vast terrain that they'd conquered over the many centuries. They had gained people from many different cultures and walks of life and religions, and everybody speaking different languages. See, Julius Caesar realized in order to keep the empire together, we need to create governorships, essentially colonies out of the empire, where we leave behind a general and troops, but not to like rule, but they did rule, but to keep the order and law, but also to teach the people about national pride, about civilization, about what it means to be Roman, to create like an educational system. But he realized that wasn't enough. Julius Caesar created then the notion that we all need to be on the same page with language. We need to speak the same language. Everybody can speak their own local languages and their own dialects, but we need one language that, as Romans, we all can agree upon. Hence, Caesar established the universal language of Latin, Roman Latin, which is why, guys, most of Europe, except for Germany and the Slavic countries, are based on Romance languages. Romance meaning Roman, Spanish, Italian, French. The English language is part Romance language. That's why studying Latin is so important for a lot of people because that's where we get so much of our language from. But that's a huge thing he did. Establish a universal language because we know that language is a thing that connects a culture together and creates a national identity. But he didn't stop there. He also realized that if we're going to be able to do business, we need to be on the same page as far as time. And think about it. We don't think of time that much sometimes. It's kind of abstract, but all these different cultures ran on their own kind of notion of time and dates. And, it's hard to do business if you're dealing with somebody who thinks it's this year as opposed to that one, or they base their time on whether the sun is over here or over there. So what does Julius Caesar do? He creates what's called the Julian calendar. And you know what the Julian calendar is? It's the calendar we use today. Julian calendar of the 12 months of the year. And when he created it, each month had 30 days, but as we worked out time, some have 31, one has 28, and all that. And he named all those days of the month, which is why the month of July is July. It means Julius. It's named after July is named after Julius Caesar. August is named after his, the person who followed him as Caesar, Augustus Caesar. June is Juno, their god Juno, So anyhow, two huge contributions he made that have lasted up until this day. The notion of a national universal language that everybody can culturally adhere to, and a notion of universal time, which is a huge feat, guys. We still work out the notion of universal time. It was only a little over 100 years ago that we established a world standardized time, of time zones. But Caesar created, we're all on the same page as what day of the week and what month are we in a 12-month year kind of notion. And then the whole notion of a timeline gets established from that point on. All right, guys. So I'll let you go on this note, but what I want you to do is for our class when we meet, which will be our last class, we're not going to do Chaucer. You can drop Chaucer. I'm not going to make you do any more journals. You don't have to do a journal in the final in week 7 or week 8. So I'm letting you go on that. But just read the Sermon on the Mount from the Gospel of Matthew. It's a link that you'll see up there in week 7. And what we'll do in our last class is I want to discuss obviously the beginning of Christianity with Jesus, the Sermon on the Mount, and we'll end with the rise of Christianity and the fall of Rome, which leads to the beginning of modern Europe, essentially. And again, I'm sorry about the technology today, guys, but I hope this helped. Good night.